Hello, all. We've got a small group today, but a very faithful one. So we will continue, and I'm hoping and praying that the recording works so that those who aren't with us today can be part of this. Let me just double check that we are. Yeah, it says we are. It says we're recording. Okay. Starting us out, last week was lesson 7, and we studied Leviticus 17 through 20, quite a few chapters there. And their purpose was to detail the laws related to holiness, especially proper worship, sexual morality, justice, and the administration of the law. Now, this week, we're going to study Leviticus 21 and 22 in lesson 8. And this scripture outlines regulations governing the conduct and holiness of the priests, the leaders, emphasizing that they've got to maintain a higher standard of purity because of their role. They're the ones offering the sacrifices for the people. They're the ones serving in the tabernacle. They've got to live to a higher standard. God said so. Therefore, they need to do that. And the chapters also discussed this week a related topic, which is the quality of the offerings we give God. They had to ensure that both the priests and the sacrifices presented to God were without blemish and just the best we could give God, because it was the best way God could show us his holiness, show us just how serious it is to respect him, because he is so holy and almighty. Just as an introduction here, I'll point out that God's people are all one in Christ and equal before God. Let's keep that in mind. Yes, still, we all have different gifts and abilities and special callings. Thank goodness we're not all the same. And some are called to be the leaders of the church. These spiritual leaders in the time of Israel, they were back then, they were the priests. Leviticus 21:4, we'll see, says, "He shall not defile himself, being a chief among his people." See, the priests oversaw God's sanctuary. They taught the people the word of God and they offered sacrifices on God's altar. It was a big deal. God's presence was in that tabernacle. They had to be holy around it, for goodness sake. They also determined God's will for the people. How'd they do that? With that, what is it, Urim and Thummim. Without the priests, what would the people do? That was their means to approach God in the old covenant. Therefore, these priests had to meet qualifications God provided for their role. God said, this is what you need to be like. They had to serve him according to his instructions. Their conduct, the physical traits of them, and their professional behavior or lack of it had to meet God's approval. Let's look first at their personal conduct. To just start out this section, I'll say that leadership brings the responsibility of maintaining as impeccable a life as you can. The priests were the role models of devotion and obedience to God. Unfortunately, as we know, the priesthood in Israel eventually declined spiritually, and it was the priest who ended up leading the people astray. It's so much so that in Hosea chapter 4, that prophet told them that they feed on the sins of my people. This is the priests feed on the sins of the people and relish their wickedness. Hmm. But when it started out, here's what God wanted. There were requirements for those priests and their families. They had to remain ceremonially clean before the Lord. Wiersbe points out, the author, that defile appears 4 times and profane 8 times in this chapter 21 of the 2 chapters we're going to read. And also that the Lord repeatedly says, I am the Lord who sanctifies you. We'll look at the first verses that Ida's going to read for us, which are the first 8 verses, and it's about the sons of Aaron.
The Lord said to Moses, give the following instructions to the priests, the descendants of Aaron. A priest must not make himself ceremonially unclean by touching the dead body of a relative. The only exceptions are his closest relatives, his mother or father, son or daughter, brother, or his virgin sister who depends on him because she has no husband. But a priest must not defile himself and make himself unclean for someone who is related to him only by marriage. The priests must not shave their heads or trim their beards or cut their bodies. They must be set apart as holy to their God and must never bring shame on the name of God. They must be holy, for they are the ones who present the special gifts of the Lord, gifts of food for their God. Priests may not marry a woman defiled by prostitution, and they may not marry a woman who is divorced from her husband, for the priests are set apart as holy to their God. You must treat them as holy because they offer up food to your God. You must consider them holy because I, the Lord, am holy, and I make you holy.
So recall, there's just one high priest ever in all of Israel. And that was Aaron when these laws were given, but his sons or his descendants served him. Later, there would be one chosen high priest, and every other one who was from the line of Aaron, the descendants of Aaron, would be simply priests, and one would be selected to be the high priest. So there was one at a time. So all these other priests were ordained and also had to meet the Lord's qualifications. Ordinary Jews, for example, they could plan weddings like they wanted or funerals as they pleased, but God told the priest how they could do that. They had to express grief a certain way, and they had to marry only certain people. See, especially talking about death and grieving. In biblical times, mourning was almost an art form practiced by specialists. You remember let's go to Mark 5:38, where it says, when they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw much commotion and weeping and wailing. Recall, he told he shushed those professional wailers away. He said, no, she's not dead, the daughter of the leader. So that in that context, we could see that. But it was the same in the time of Moses when he made these laws. When God handed down these laws, God expected the priests to show sorrow, of course, at death of a loved one, but also to function as his servants. They still had this job to do. It was such an important job. And anyone who touched a dead body or entered a tent where someone had died, even just entering the tent where someone's died, you'd be defiled for a week. You couldn't do your job. You couldn't be a priest performing his function. And the people were left with a void that way. So they couldn't do it, except for very special situations. They could. God allowed them to defile themselves for their parents, their children, their brothers, and their unmarried sisters. All others were off limits. If your brother-in-law or your best friend, no, you can't do that. Obedience had to take precedence over affection. The Lord even regulated the manner of their grief. This is worth going through. 21, 4-6, as I had said, but a priest must not defile himself by making himself unclean for someone who's related to him only by marriage, must not shave their heads or trim their beards or cut their bodies. They must be set apart as holy and never bring shame. They must be holy because they are the ones who present the special gifts. And then later, back in 19, it says, do not trim the hair on your temples or trim your beards. Do not cut your bodies for the dead, and do not mark your skin with tattoos, for I am the Lord. And what's that about? Well, you see, such practices like that at the time, that was a signal that they were pagan customs. God's people, however, were not to sorrow as others who have no hope. According to 1 Thessalonians, we don't need to sorrow because we know we need to sorrow. Like I said in the prayer just a while ago, but we also know we have that hope that our loved ones are in a better place. If any priest did shave his head or beard or cut his body, he acted like a heathen. Priest who acted like a pagan, well, what would be wrong with that? Well, they would encourage those that he's leading to disobey God's law. Knowing God and serving at his altar was a great privilege for these priests. To disobey meant dishonoring and defiling God's name and the sacrifices that they presented. You know, we know that about Jesus, that his commands are not burdensome, and my burden is light. And he's not a hard taskmaster. And in the same vein, no priest should complain about restrictions that he's put under. After all, serving the Lord and his people is a privilege worth any sacrifice on this earth. Moving on to marriage, God didn't allow the priests to marry prostitutes or divorcees in pagan religions. And again, it gets back to kind of pagan practice because temple prostitutes served as priests, for goodness sake. But prostitution was an honor in the Canaanite religion, but it was banned in Israel by God. And since the priest's sons held a special place, you know, the regular, since they held a special place, they were part of the priesthood themselves eventually. They had to avoid a woman who might call it alien blood into the family, not to sound prejudiced or anything, but it's not really the blood. Maybe a better word is influence. Yeah, because you're raised by your mom a lot. And so the only way to ensure that purity was to marry someone who's part of your clan and is a virgin. That was God's law. Now, in the New Covenant, the qualifications for church officers are outlined in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1, and in both of those, Paul emphasizes the importance of a church officer's being the right person and including his wife and family. They're part of the decision process. Should this person be a deacon or an elder, for whatever church? Let's look at the priest's daughter now. Now, if the priest's daughter became a prostitute, the priest didn't lose his ministry, but the daughter lost her life. She's going to be stoned to death. Now let's look at the high priest responsibilities. Okay, there's one high priest, as I mentioned, and that's chapters 10 through 15 that I'm just going to read here.
The high priest has the highest rank of all the priests. The anointing oil has been poured on his head, and he has been ordained to wear the priestly garments. He must never leave his hair uncombed or tear his clothing. He must not defile himself by going near a dead body. He may not make himself ceremonially unclean even for his father or mother. He must not defile the sanctuary of his God by leaving it to attend to a dead person, for he has been made holy by the anointing oil of his God. I am the Lord. The high priest may marry only a virgin. He may not marry a widow, a woman who is divorced, or a woman who has defiled herself by prostitution. She must be a virgin from his own clan, so that he will not dishonor his descendants among his clan. For I am the Lord who makes him holy.
Okay. Like I say, the priests had obligations and were set apart and had their own restrictions that God placed on. The high priest had even more. He was anointed and clothed in holy garments. Unlike the ordinary priest, he couldn't even defile himself by touching the dead bodies of his own family. He couldn't grieve in the usual ways. He couldn't leave the tabernacle for a burial. God expected Aaron and his sons to remain on duty and not engage in other camp activities. So let's see some of these restrictions. Well, first, could marry only a virgin. That ensured, again, no unholy influence would invade the family and pollute it. Also marrying an unfit woman would defile his offspring and the whole priesthood that God had sanctified. So these special regulations don't apply to church workers today. However, the principles remain. For example, a godly marriage with godly children forms a spiritual fortress for God's servants. We should pray for the pastors and the other spiritual leaders that we know, because they are particular targets of Satan. They've got bullseyes on their back, and he is especially after them, as Jeff Jeters used to say.
Yes. Bullseye on his back.
Bullseye on his back. Let's move on now to physical characteristics. That's verses 16 through 24.
Then the Lord said to Moses, "Give the following instructions to Aaron and all future generations. None of your descendants who has any defect will qualify to offer food to his God. No one who has a defect qualifies, whether he is blind, lame, disfigured, deformed, or has a broken foot or arm, or is hunchbacked or dwarfed, or has a defective eye, or skin sores, or scabs, or damaged testicles. No descendant of Aaron who has a defect may approach the altar to present special gifts to the Lord. Since he has a defect, he may not approach the altar to offer food to his God. However, he may eat from the food offered to God, including the holy offerings and the most holy offerings. Yet because of his physical defect, he may not enter the room behind the inner curtain or approach the altar, for this would defile my holy places. I am the Lord who makes them holy." So Moses gave these instructions to Aaron and his sons and to all the Israelites.
I looked at my phone while I was reading, and I got an email from Larry and Janet that said, "Sorry we missed y'all. Sorry, we hope you're okay." So apparently they dialed in to the Zoom, and They were on a Zoom and we were on a Zoom.
Oh,
So
wow.
it was a Zoom problem. I think we'll just keep going and then we'll respond. Sorry about that, guys.
Mhm.
Well, anyway, regarding physical characteristics, we'll start by saying that everyone born into Adam's race is what?
Sinner.
A sinner. But our physical, yeah, but our physical and our moral defects do not hinder our salvation or service. Thank God. God invites the lost. Remember what Jesus, who did he go to? He went to the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame. All believers can be living sacrifices for his glory, regardless of handicaps. That is an overriding principle to keep in our heads as we go through this section. Now, in the Old Testament, in Israel, God required priests to be free from defects. First, the sacrifices offered had to be perfect. Second, the priest exemplified the great high priest who came without defect. So they were to be precursors of Jesus, the great high priest. The people didn't treat a disqualified priest, okay, as like vermin or a second class citizen, or while the priests with their defects, with priests who had physical defects, couldn't serve at the altar, but they could share in the meals, the sacrificial meals. And in this, there are many Hebrew words for defects that we know that they mean defects by the context, but nobody knows really what they mean. However, we see clearly in these Hebrew verses blind, lame, disfigured, deformed. Now, some of those defects might be birth defects or the consequence of an illness. Back then they weren't as good at treating diseases. Eunuchs, they couldn't or to even participate in Israel's worship, and they couldn't serve at the altar. The perpetuation of the priestly vital line was vital. I guess that might be a justification for it. If it's you're the high priest and you're a eunuch, well, so much for that line. Anyway, it just Wearsby then reiterates we shouldn't use these passages to say, oh well, the people with the defect, God must not like them as much or anything like that. That was not the purpose of this. The purpose was the fact that God was wanted to emphasize his perfection. And the closest thing to God on earth at that time was the priest. And that's why he wanted to show that. And he also points out that a beautiful soul can dwell in a crippled body, and the Lord can greatly use such individuals. One that's here today has a Christian talk show is Joni Eareckson Tada, who was, as a child, she dove and broke her neck in a shallow pond or something, and so she's been quadriplegic since childhood, and she's become a great spiritual inspiration and leader. Another one that Wearsby mentions is Arturo Toscanini. He was a great conductor of symphonies, and he owed his success to a handicap, which was nearsightedness. Because he's nearsighted, he had to memorize all his music. And then, so one day, he was just in the orchestra. The conductor of the day fell ill. He couldn't lead the orchestra. So Toscanini went up there. He knew everything by memory, so he could conduct the orchestra. And that started his career. Well, anyway, let's move on to professional concerns rather. In the chapter 22, I'm going to read this since we're short of time, and this is the next chapter, and I'm going to kind of skim through it. So then the Lord said to Moses, "Tell Aaron and his sons to be very careful with these sacred gifts." So now we're talking about gifts that the Israelites set apart for me, so they do not bring shame on my holy name. I am the Lord. Give them these instructions. So in future generations, you can't be ceremonially unclean. And if you are, you're going to be cut apart from the people. You're going to be segregated. If you got a skin disease or any discharge, we talked about this last week, right? So here's some more of that. Touch an animal. If you're unclean until the morning. So even if you're not a priest, even if just a regular person, you can't offer offerings. You can't go near the temple. And then after that, you can, if you make an offering when the sun goes down. Similar things about wild animals died that you find that are dead, like we saw last week. You got to follow, the priests have to follow his instructions, or he is going to be punished and will die. No one outside the priest's family can eat the sacred offerings, not even a guest. So priests can't have guests over for a meal if the meal comes from the sacrifice. And that's where they got most of their food, from people giving sacrifices. But if the priest has a slave, the slave can eat the food. So, some exceptions there. If then there's an exception for if the priest's daughter marries and then her husband dies, then she comes back into his family, then she can be treated like family again and eat the food. So that there's that compassion in there. But if someone eats sacred food and doesn't realize it, he doesn't have to die, but he's got to pay the priest for the amount eaten plus an additional 20%. So you get fined 20% even if you didn't know it. So it'd be kind of mean for a priest to invite a guest, and then the guest finds out, oh, it was sacred food. Then why'd you do that? Now I've got to pay this fine, that kind of thing. Let's look at some of the offerings themselves. The Lord said to Moses, "Give Aaron his sons and the Israelites these instructions." And they apply it to everybody, including the foreigners living with you. If you present a gift as a burnt offering to the Lord, to fulfill a vow or voluntary offering, I'm not going to accept it unless it's a male animal with no defects. And it can only be a bull or a ram or a male goat. Don't bring anything else. Don't bother. I won't accept it. If you present a peace offering to the Lord, it's whether it's a vow or voluntary offering, it must be perfect, no defect. Can't be blind, crippled, injured. Can't even have a wart on it. Any scab or sore. If the bull or lamb has a leg that's too long or too short, you can offer it's a voluntary offering, but not to fulfill a vow. Okay. Why? Because God said so. It can't have damaged testicles or be castrated. And then he said, when a calf or lamb or goat's born, it's got to be left with its mother for 7 days. From the 8th day on, it can be a gift to the Lord, but you can't slaughter a mother animal and her offspring on the same day. And you have to eat the entire animal when the day it's presented. Don't leave anything. These are just rules. You must faithfully keep all my commands by putting them into practice, for I am the Lord. Do not bring shame upon my holy name, for I will display my holiness among the people of Israel. I am the Lord who makes you holy. It was I who rescued you from the land of Egypt, that I might be your God. I am the Lord. So, to serve the Lord acceptably, a priest had to meet specific qualifications. Yeah, being a son of Aaron wasn't enough. Having no defects wasn't enough. He had to also please the Lord with his ministry itself. Worshipers may see the outward ritual, but God examines the heart. The phrase separate themselves from the holy things is kind of establishes this chapter's theme. It means treating sacred things with respect. The priest offered sacrifices all year, which could lead to kind of, you do it every day, it gets kind of rote, gets kind of, as Wiersbe calls it, a professional attitude. And that could make the routine become meaningless, shallow, and just something just ritual like that you're not even thinking about as you do it. It's just muscle memories doing it. Carelessness at the altar could occur in three ways. Well, you could have through carelessness or just because you've done it and done it and done it. You have uncleanness. The priest could be unclean. You could have unqualified guests, unacceptable sacrifices. So, because of that, the priest could defile himself, the sacrifices, the altar. Let's look at the unclean priests and guests. So, let's say a priest got defiled himself but did nothing. How, like he accidentally touched a Samaritan who was standing, who was on the side of the road and got defiled because he did that. And then he went on and didn't tell anybody. Nobody'd know. Outwardly, no one would know, but he could go and serve at the altar, eat his offerings, and pretend that nothing had happened. But of course, God would know. And if he did that, the priest risked death. I mean, God's presence is in the Holy of Holies of the tabernacle, about 10 yards from him. That kind of behavior of the priest suggests that he puts himself ahead of God. Because why would he do that? Because he cares more about his reputation in front of the people than his character. And of course, that's hypocrisy. He worries about others knowing he's unclean and not about what he's doing to defile God's sacred ministry. Like the Pharisees that Jesus chastised, woe to you, Pharisees, you whitewashed tombs who are dirty inside. He appears clean, but it's really toxic inside. All who serve the Lord will be honest before God. They will minister first to please him. That is just as applicable today as back then. We want to thank God for the privilege of simply being able to serve him. We want to treat his things with respect. Hebrews, the writer of Hebrews says in chapter 4 that nothing in all creation is hidden from God's sight. Joseph demonstrated this when he refused his temptress, remember, saying, how can I do this great wickedness, a sin against God? The greatest protection against this kind of rote professionalism and hypocrisy is the fear of the Lord. The fear of the Lord is revealed in a tender conscience. Conscience is like a window letting in light. Don't you love that? A conscience is like a window letting in light. When that window becomes dirty, the light fades and it becomes unclean, filthy. Well, now let's talk about quickly unqualified guests. Okay, so a priest could eat portions of specific offerings and share them with his family members, as I mentioned. But if he included the outsiders, he sinned against the Lord, and he was sinning against his guests, because that poor unqualified guest, like I mentioned, would bring a trespass offering plus a fine. That's what he had to do if he ate that meal unknowingly. And so a faithful priest must have always had the honesty and courage to know to say no, when to say no to things, and to him, both to himself and to others. That's true today as then. And this included daughters married outside the priestly family. A loving heart of a priest might have wanted to include the daughter-in-law in the celebration, but it would hurt them, the daughter-in-law, because then they'd have to pay this fine. Saying no is one of the hardest parts of, well, ministry or anything we do. However, to keep our fellowship pure and for the good of the person we're saying no to, sometimes we have to do that. Some pastors even decline to marry a believer to an unbeliever. And when they do that, they create enemies, especially among the relatives, yet they keep their conscience pure before God. Parents who prevent their children from having harmful relationships may get some misunderstandings, we'll call them, between themselves and the child, but they know what they're doing is right. Okay, we've got two more topics, so let's do unacceptable sacrifices. I read those already, and we'll just talk about them. So we talked about the priest. Now let's talk about the sacrifice. See, the priest had to be free from physical defects, as I mentioned, and similarly, the sacrifices had to be perfect. You got to wonder how often the priest might have had to say, I can't, you brought this beautiful bull, but it's got a wart right there. Sorry, I can't use it. When you bring injured, crippled, or diseased animals as sacrifices, should I accept them? Malachi said that, because that's what they ended up doing in the end. And then Malachi says, try offering that bull to your governor. Would he be pleased? Would he accept you? So God's servants, priests or pastors, must not make it easy for people to sin. Oh boy, that's a lesson I think we just need to hear today. They must also encourage people to give their best to the Lord. David had the right attitude when he wrote in 2 Samuel 24:24 that I will not sacrifice to the Lord my God burnt offerings that cost me nothing. The context there was he said that, he didn't write it, but the context was that David had sinned and he'd done a census and God gave him a punishment. And so then David wanted to end that early. So he was going to do a sacrifice to the Lord in a particular place that turned out to be in Jerusalem. Anyway, the man who owned the property said, here, I'll give you the sacrifice. And David said, no, I got to do that. I can't do that if it costs me nothing. Similarly, a priest respecting his ministry would only accept animals meeting God's requirements. And sending a worshiper away with false assurance, they say, okay, that was good enough, might damage that person's spiritual life. The special requirements about the age of offerings, like can't be too young, shows God's tenderness toward his creation. He loves his animals. For example, if a lamb or a calf younger than a week were sacrificed, it might die during the transport. It's just too young. More than one social critic has noted that the way people treat animals reflects how they treat humans. Suppose the priest asks, why should I honor God's sacrifices? At least 3 verses from this chapter answer that question. Why should you honor God? First, these are God's commandments. God said so. Second, this is, like I mentioned, how we glorify God's name before his people. And third, the Lord commands us also, the Lord who gives us these commands also redeemed us from slavery. We in that is such a great gift to free us from our sins that we should gladly want to do whatever he says. Okay, to summarize this lesson, it covered the Leviticus 21 through 22. It gave the laws governing the conduct and holiness of the priest. It emphasizes that they had to maintain a higher standard of purity due to their role in offering sacrifices and serving in the tabernacle where God dwelt. These chapters also included regulations regarding the quality of the offerings, ensuring that both the priests and the sacrifices presented to God were without blemish, because that reflects God's perfection. Next week, we're going to cover a really neat chapter. It's Leviticus 23, covering the 7 annual feasts of Israel. These are Sabbath, Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the First Fruits, the Feast of First Fruits, the Feast of Weeks, the Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacles. Jews know how to party. These festivals serve as holy convocations, commemorating God's provision and covenant with his people. It's so beautiful. Every one of them is focused at God, and they're fun events. God doesn't want you to be dour, surly. He wants you to be happy and joyful. So that's good. We're going to be joyful next week. In lesson 9 of this book, Be Holy. Okay. Jeannie, you have any thoughts or comments?
A lot of thoughts.
Mhm.
I'm repeating myself, but every week I say I'm so grateful for Jesus Christ, because I don't believe I could have followed all those rules.
Well, you're not the only one. I don't think anybody
I doubt it.
was able to follow the rules. Not one. No, not one.
That's why God brought his son to give to us.
Yes.
Fixed it.
And I pray we don't disrespect that. I sometimes wonder if our church services, well, we're certainly not a temple. We're not respectful like they were taught to be in the temple.
Yeah.
But I'm guilty. There was always too much talking in church. And, you know, I don't know that the leaders demanded. We have had pastors in our church that just would get up there and tell people. And it would help. You know, everybody would quiet down. But some pastors, especially these really young ones, I don't think they feel strong enough in their leadership or something. But, you know, we just pray about that.
I worry about the holiness issue that, or the being close to God kind of people, you know, having leaders who blatantly disregard laws. God's laws, that, you know, even New Testament laws. So, you know, well, we're running late, so I won't get on that soapbox today. But
Oh, okay. Some of us have time, you know.
okay, I did. You were going to say something?
Just that it amazes me what a close relationship Moses had with God to get all of this detail from him. And you look through Leviticus, every single chapter says, and God said to Moses, and you look in Numbers, and there it is some more. God said to Moses, and just amazing. Close.
And that was not a small group of people, you know. I'm lying here thinking that wasn't a few people like we have in church. That was thousands of people. I never knew how they got all the word to everybody.
Mm.
That's a good question. Yeah. All right.
So
Well,
the years have gone by and from this point, I keep thinking about now when is Moses going to die because he was not allowed to cross into the promised land?
well, he's got quite a few years, Ed. We're early in the process. We're just getting the laws handed down and and described, and they've still got some well, at probably about 38 more years of wandering. So Moses is far from being from death at this point. He's only about what, 82 at this point?
Mhm.
I think you told me, but I don't remember where they're doing this wandering. Give me a place on the map.
It's called the Negev, and it's South Israel today.
Okay.
It's a deserty, kind of very rugged terrain, beautiful terrain, but it only gets about 4 inches of rain a year.
Yeah.
And there are a few oases there, but without an oasis, nothing lives. I think probably 4,000 years ago, there was a lot more rain there than today.
Yeah.
Because we've been coming out of a the last ice age wasn't that long ago, and we things were probably cooler than today, and then now we have the global warming. But anyway, to answer your question, south part of Israel.
Okay.
Kind
I'm
of.
sure you told me, but I might be getting a little old.
Oh, I'd say within a range of 30 miles from the Gaza Strip today.
Yeah.
Off to the east from there.
I know y'all pray about that Israeli situation. I sure do. Because in my mind, I'm not too sure though. Netanyahu, I'm not too sure that he's following God's way or his own way. You know?
Probably both.
Prayerful matter.
Yeah.
Just because they're Jewish, you know, so many people now, of course, are not wanting to let them get by with it. I still support Israel. I do. But I'll tell you, it's a grievous matter.
It is. I want it to end. All right. Well, thank you for those inputs, Jeannie. Thank you, Ida. I'm going to stop recording.